In the spring of 2010, the federal government required cash-strapped states to sign on to the Common Core standards in order to qualify for over $4.35 billion in race-to-the-top stimulus funds. The deadline was such that the states had to accept Common Core sight unseen. Now the standards are out, and it's clear that the latest educational fad is nothing more than a race to the middle. There is a better way to educate our kids. It is a method of education that has produced some of the greatest minds in the history of the Western world. That method is classical education.
A bit about another kind of education. Whether we're successful in stopping the implementation of Common Core, or if it fails of its own accord, and it will fail, we must be in a position to offer a better alternative than simply a return to the previous misguided system. It's not enough to simply go back to what we had. As such, I'm here this evening to talk about classical education. That may be a term that you're not real familiar with, and hopefully after my time with you this evening, you have at least a rudimentary understanding of what we mean by classical education. I'd like to pause briefly before we begin our topic to acknowledge and to say thanks to Dr. Terrence Moore at Hillsdale College, who's allowed me to borrow liberally from one of his articles for my presentation this evening. So thank you to Dr. Moore. Classical education has a history of over 2,500 years in the Western world. It began in Greece. It was adopted by the Romans. It faltered after the fall of Rome. It made a slow but steady recovery during the Middle Ages, and was again brought to perfection during the Italian Renaissance. The classical system of education passed to England, and from there to America through colonial settlement. At the time of our nation's founding, classical education was a thriving system. Thomas Jefferson, arguably the most learned of our founders, recommended classical learning and recommended Greek and Latin as a basis for education. The founders routinely referenced classics like Plutarch's Lives of the noble Greeks and Romans in both their formal and their daily conversation. Americans venerated George Washington, largely because he exhibited the virtues associated with the Roman patriot Cincinnatus. So important has been classical education in the West that one could say the march of civilization has been directly tied to the vibrancy of classical schools. With that said, I think we have to ask the following question. We have to ask, what was it about this system of education that so captivated and shaped the Western world? In answering that question, there are really four components or four central tenets to the system, and I'll share those with you briefly. First, classical education is a system of education that values knowledge for its own sake. Second, it upholds the standards of correctness, logic, beauty, weightiness, and truth, all intrinsic to the liberal arts. Thirdly, classical education demands moral virtue of its adherents or followers. And then lastly or fourthly, it prepares human beings to assume their place as responsible citizens in the political order. Let's go through these one by one. I said first, it's a system of education that values knowledge for its own sake. In doing so, it represents a break from modern theories of education that seek schooling merely as preparation for adult work. Or in the case of the latest fad in education, and here of course I'm talking about Common Core, proponents cite as their goal making students both college and career ready. The classical view of education is quite different. It begins with the premise that humans are thinking creatures, that we are innately curious, that we have within us a desire to know objective truth. We see this curiosity in children as soon as they begin to speak, when the first question is always, what is it? Children demonstrate what is true of all people. We are natural learners. Therefore, any plan of education should take advantage of people's natural curiosity. Classroom theories that stall children in their learning because they are not, quote, ready for it, or because it's not, quote, age appropriate, or by teaching to the slowest learner in the class are not only counterproductive, but they're also insulting to the human mind. Contrary to what future teachers learn in progressive university education classes, knowledge does not come to the student unaided from nature. Children need explicit instruction to understand the world around them. They have the tools, but they need the direction. Every child has at his or her disposal a veritable arsenal of mental capabilities, including memory, reason, imagination, a sense of beauty, and a facility for language. Classical education, unlike many of the modern theories, does not simply leave children to their own mental urges or inclinations. Rather, it feeds and directs. It strengthens children's mental capabilities in the same way that sports aid in physical development. The focus on rigorous mental training is an important difference between classical education and modern progressive education. So classical education puts young minds to work. It leads young people to understand themselves and the world around them. One of the benefits of this approach is the development of what is known as cultural literacy. Coined by retired Yale University professor E.D. Hirsch, the term cultural literacy refers to that reservoir of common facts, ideas, and references that a people must possess if they're to communicate effectively. How many of us have thrown up our hands in frustration at the state of our American politics? It seems we have two parties who are simply talking past each other rather than engaging in meaningful debate. The answer is that they are speaking different languages, because our public schools have failed for several generations to effectively transmit a certain level of cultural literacy, in effect leaving us without a common language. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, I think, is a terrific example of how cultural literacy works. We're all familiar with the words. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's audience understood when the president spoke of a proposition that all men are created equal, he was referencing the Declaration of Independence. There was a common understanding between the speaker and his audience. He did not need to retell the story of the Revolution. Because the audience had a certain level of cultural literacy, Lincoln was able to make one of the most powerful speeches in history in just 270 words. Sadly, that same speech would not have the same meaning today. Some critics may say, however, that classical education, by promoting a sense of cultural literacy, is dedicated merely to ornamental trivia. It's designed to create Jeopardy champions, is what you sometimes hear from critics. This is, of course, not true. As we are sadly learning today, only a culturally literate nation can live up to the demands placed upon it by history and the present condition of the world. Only a culturally literate individual can comprehend and navigate the vast areas of human knowledge essential to the political, economic, and moral well-being. The second component of a program of classical education is that it upholds the standards of correctness, logic, beauty, weightiness, and truth, intrinsic, as I said, to all of the liberal arts. In other words, in addition to requiring young people to know certain things, a classical education also teaches them to make judgments according to certain standards. To be classical means to uphold a standard of excellence. The classical works of Greece and Rome are not simply great because they are old. They are great because they employ harmonious language to depict remarkable human events and to explain the transcendent ideals of human existence. The study of language provides the best example, I think. Everyone can talk. Most people can read and write at a functional level. But classical education requires more than simply functional literacy. It teaches students high standards of grammar, precision in word choice, and eloquence based in a love for language. As part of a classical education, students are exposed to the highest examples of eloquence, attained by the greatest writers and greatest speakers in our history. This is important because there is a difference between using Shakespeare and a more modern Dick and Jane type children's book to teach grammar. I'm not suggesting that all modern resources are bad. Rather, I recognize that by using the classics, we can kill not 2, but 3 birds with one stone. By preferring Shakespeare to an anonymous Dick and Jane book, we teach grammar, we teach cultural literacy, and we teach beauty of language all at the same time. This is important because young people are desperately in need of standards of thought and of real beauty. For many modern young people, their speech ranges from the sloppy to the vulgar. Those persons whose only expressions of approval and disapproval are, "That's cool," or "That sucks," lacks not only a descriptive vocabulary, but also the ability to judge events according to their nature and their gravity. Rather than seeking to meet a state-imposed common standard, those who embrace a classical education agree with the motto of Winston Churchill, "I shall be satisfied with the very best." The third component of a program of classical education is that it demands moral virtue of its adherents. This is essential because education is first a moral enterprise. Schools can approach the moral development of students in one of 3 ways. They can ignore moral issues altogether. They can open up moral questions for students to explore in a, quote, non-judgmental or non-committal environment. Or they can teach classical views of self-command using traditional teaching methods. Methods 1 and 2 are most often the approaches used in the public schools. One only needs to pick up the newspaper or turn on the television to see the outcome of this sort of so-called character development. In the classical curriculum, there's room for teaching virtue without a particular denominational bent. Unlike the typically modern classroom where students endlessly discuss the supposedly equally valid solutions to a moral problem, in the classical classroom, students are confronted with the great stories of self-command and self-sacrifice found in literature and in history. These stories show that actions have consequences and that there's a clear difference between right and wrong. Rather than encouraging young people to emulate the virtues of their pop culture idols, classical education teaches them to emulate the moral virtues of heroes and heroines. The final component, or fourth component, of a program of classical education is preparing human beings to assume their place as responsible citizens in the political order. Classical education has always been concerned with the political order and with the formation of true community. Our American founders understood that political wisdom and virtue does not come easy. They must be cultivated. More than 2 centuries of American history have confirmed that this nation can only be sustained by citizens who understand, serve, and defend our founding principles. Our founders, as much as they embraced liberty, were deeply concerned about the unchecked passions of a poorly educated public. In light of this concern, a classical education offers the best instruction in our nation's founding principles. Students will learn that married with each right they enjoy as Americans is a corresponding responsibility. This education can best be done through a thorough study of American history and government, consisting principally in the reading of primary sources. Only by this method can students be prepared to take their place as defenders of the American inheritance. Let me conclude with this. Contrary to what you would hear from some of the critics of classical education, it is far from arcane or dull or unimaginative. Rather, the classical view understands that a human being without knowledge of the past, without reverence for his cultural inheritance, and without a judgment formed by the standards of true greatness is much like a man with amnesia. He knows not who he is or where he comes from. He knows neither his rights nor his duties. He understands neither his debts nor his debtors. Worse still, he's likely to become the pawn of another. Americans should support the notion of classical education, not only because of its centuries-long track record of success, but also because the progressive educational system has failed time and time again. It has failed to provide our young people with the cultural, moral, and civic literacy to live a productive and happy life. It fails them today. It fails them with a one-size-fits-all, top-down, servile system of education known as Common Core. It fails to recognize our most basic human desires. Rather than wishing to become automatons programmed solely for the world of work, young people have an innate longing to know the good, the beautiful, and the true. It's about time we once again begin serving that need. It's about time we consider the benefits of classical education. Thank you.